So to introduce our first speaker, Holly Lawford-Smith is an associate professor in the political philosophy at the University of Melbourne. Her book, Gender Critical Feminism, is coming out with Oxford University Press in May. Holly's topic, no conflict of interest between trans activism and other groups.
As I'm sure we all know, gender identity activists tend to deny that there's any conflict of interest between what they're pushing for and women's interests. They present particular social and legal reforms as being good for trans people and bad for no one. And this outright refusal to acknowledge the conflict of interest means that we can't articulate the conflict or put forward reasonable proposals for a balance of interest between the impacted groups. So it's a way of making sure that they get everything they want without having to compromise at all. So here are just a few examples. So example number one, in a BBC article from 2018, a trans woman was quoted on the issue of the Labour Party allowing self-identifying trans women to be part of women-only party shortlists, saying, why should there be a debate at all? It's that person's life. They're not really doing any harm to anybody else by saying I'm female or male or whatever. Second example, an ACLU, the new enemy, article from 2020 claimed to debunk the myth that the participation of trans athletes hurts cis women, writing in response that excluding trans women invites gender policing, reinforces stereotypes that women are weak and in need of protection, and may undermine team unity and cause and encourage divisiveness. So we just get a list of all the ways that including men in women's sport is actually really great for women, not just neutral, but positively great. And then final example, is a Vox article from 2017, which is dealing with bathroom ordinances in the United States. And that insists that there is no evidence that letting trans people use the bathroom for their gender identity causes public safety problems. Lopez 2017 hyperlinks to Lopez 2018. Is that true? Maybe I got it the wrong way around. Anyway, hyperlinks to himself. To another article in which he declares that there is not a single reported instance of this kind. Okay, so the idea is if trans women want to use women's bathrooms, there's no evidence that doing so causes problems, then there's no real reason not to let them do it. So these statements, I think, all have something in common. They take gender identity activists' proposed social and legal reforms to be good for trans people and not bad for anyone else. And then in some cases, like the ACLU's comments on trans women athletes, they go so far as to take those changes to be positively good for others, specifically women. But the ACLU, for example, didn't entertain any of their opponents' views about why permitting males to compete in women's sports may in fact be bad for women athletes, or at least not entirely good. And the authors of the piece is about bathroom ordinances and birth certificate reforms, which I've taken up for time reasons. They conflate absence of evidence, so we haven't heard about anything bad happening, with evidence of absence. We've got good reason to think nothing bad will happen. Okay, so I think at least over here in gender critical land, we're all pretty fluent in knowing that there is indeed a conflict of interests. And so there are familiar categories in which this conflict of interest tends to be articulated. So again, I think it's likely to be familiar to absolutely everyone here. There's some public acknowledgement of and discussion of prisons, sports, and bathrooms in particular. Bathrooms kind of to an annoying degree, because I think that's the one that the media seizes on, and it's not the one that we think is the most serious. And then I think perhaps to a slightly lesser extent, there is some discussion and recognition of issues with data collection and distortion, issues with gay dating, so in particular due to that BBC article, I think it was last year. And then also, unique to Australia, some recent acknowledgement and discussion of issues in religious schools as a result of the religious discrimination bill. So what I wanted to do in this bit of time is talk about a conflict of interest that I think gets a lot less airtime, but is also really important. And this centers around the appropriation of feminists' politically important concepts. And this, I think, will fulfill an aim that is important for our activism, which is that we try to move out of the defensive and into the offensive. stop spending so much of our time answering their absolutely ludicrous claims and accusations and start articulating our own accusations.
Yes.
So what I've tried to do, I'm going to talk about appropriation and silencing. And this this might be an annoying way to do it, so I'm sort of testing it out on you guys. What I'm going to do is give you a sort of little thought experiment that puts the point in terms of race and so works by analogy. And the reason why is that I think this might be helpful for explaining it to people who don't know much about feminism and maybe don't care that much about women, so might not understand the problem or see the force of it if you just told it in terms of women. Of course, you all do know about feminism, so I just thought, still, the thought experiment might be helpful when we're communicating with new people. But I would be interested just in the informal breaks or in the discussion to hear whether you think it's helpful or not. Okay, the concept is sovereignty. A group of indigenous activists in a historically colonized country make use of the concept sovereignty. They've done so for roughly the last century in order to press their claim to authority as a nation within a state currently governed by their colonizers' law and structured by their colonizers' norms. Before this concept, sovereignty, came into widespread use, many indigenous people had simply accepted the social and legal conditions in their country. But a great book by an indigenous elder sparked an impassioned indigenous rights movement. This concept, sovereignty, features heavily in most of their movement's books, draft legal bills, and political leaflets. It is central to the way that indigenous activists explain the social, legal, and economic problems they see themselves as facing, and to the way that they articulate their political demands. In the last few years, however, a group of young people have begun using this important concept of sovereignty in a very different way. Some of these young people are themselves Indigenous, but they're not involved in, or even particularly aware of, their people's political history. This group has decided that sovereignty is an identity. According to them, this identity comes in different subtypes. The main two are king and queen, but there are plenty of others on offer. And these can be signaled through aesthetic choices, particularly about hairstyles, makeup, clothing, footwear, and accessories. Most important for social signaling purposes are the choices about accessories. I think next slide. A market has sprung up in accessories that hat tip to monarchy, including artful and ornate diadems, tiaras, and crowns, and also swords, orbs, and scepters. So it's not unusual to see a university student wearing ripped jeans and dirty sneakers together with like a gleaming golden crown. Retailers have rushed to accommodate this new trend by designing backpacks, satchels, and handbags with purpose-built straps and loops to carry these somewhat cumbersome accessories. And billboards throughout the city's shopping districts feature young people decked out in this new aesthetic. Okay, slide. I think there are three interesting features of this thought experiment. First of all, a collective concept has become an individual one. So for the Indigenous activists, sovereignty meant something like collective self-determination or collective authority. For the young people, sovereignty is an individual choice, or perhaps an individual revelation or self-discovery. It's about an individual's self-concept rather than about her membership in a group of people who share a common predicament. Second of all, an external concept has become an internal one. The Indigenous activists use the concept of sovereignty to articulate the fact that their country's colonizers had imposed alien laws and norms upon them, and in order to resist that imposition. This is cultural imperialism. It's something that is done to them by others. In the new usage, it's turned into something that the individual herself does. And third and finally, the processes of capitalism have a major hand in the new usage. They might have played some very minor role in the Indigenous activists' usage, so for example in the printing and selling of their movement's literature, or in the design and retail of t-shirts with political slogans on them. But many more companies are able to capitalize on the new usage in order to sell clothing and accessories. So the natural movement of the market creates a tide that carries this new usage along, while the Indigenous activists didn't have that advantage. Okay, so while there's a lively debate, both kind of socially, culturally, and like inside philosophy over what exactly counts as cultural appropriation and what doesn't, I think what I've imagined in this thought experiment is surely a pretty good candidate for cultural appropriation. And I think it's made more egregious, not less egregious, by the fact that what has been appropriated, this concept of sovereignty, was a political concept, one that was instrumental to a socially marginalized group's resistance project. So this thought experiment simply puts in terms of race what has happened with sex. Since the second wave, feminists have made use of the concept of gender in order to articulate the distinction between what they are, female, and what they have been made to be, or at least attempted to be made to be, feminine, as a matter of living in male-dominant or male-supremacist societies. This concept picks out a significant moral and political wrong, the socializing of females into femininity, where the content of femininity has historically worked in the service of men, or men's interests, at many times literally shaping women into the servants and helpmates of men. So when second wave feminists uttered slogans, political slogans like gender abolition now, they meant to express their anger and frustration with the way that girls and women have been treated all around the world. In 2017, National Geographic published a special issue titled Gender Revolution, popularizing a shift in the meaning of gender toward what I've described for sovereignty. And then in the associated documentary with the same title, the host, Katie Couric, voices over images from the second wave, saying, back then, the revolution was really about changing gender roles. Now it seems it's about the whole concept of gender itself. So for the gender revolutionaries, who I prefer to call gender identity activists, the injustice is in the pairing together of sex and gender identity. The revolution for them consists in stopping that pairing in order to stop the damage that they think is done when the pairing is incorrect. So for them, the moral wrong is located in the assumption that a male baby is or will be a boy and then a man, that a female baby is or will be a girl and then a woman. I'm glossing over some complexities to do with sex denialism and gender terms, as we don't have time. So they think people should be free to choose their own gender identities, and these impositions of labels or identities onto boys and girls will be especially damaging for the kids who turn out to be transgender, including non-binary. So kind of roughly on a par morally, perhaps, with our assuming when we deal with all children or teenagers that they're heterosexual. When we know that some of them will not be, and we'll already know that they are not. So the accusation is that gender identity activists are involved in cultural appropriation when they take the feminist concept of gender and change its meaning. They're taking what is probably the central concept for second wave feminism, I would say for feminism unmodified, in McKinnon's terms, or feminism unqualified, and they're giving it a whole new meaning. In doing so, they take something away from feminists that feminists need in order to do feminist politics. How can I talk to my students about gender as a system of oppressive norms when they all come into the classroom thinking that gender is a subjective individual identity and are utterly confused when I seem to be meaning something different by it? So appropriation here has a silencing effect. In changing the meaning of a politically important concept, we make unsayable what the concept previously articulated. So even if the young people in my thought experiment and their parallels in the gender identity activist movement were ignorant of Indigenous political history, even if their intentions were only to express themselves and have fun, and even if the proximate explanation of the sovereignty as identity trend was only social status signaling and peer bonding for the consumers and profit for the producers, I think it's arguably still true that something morally bad has happened. It's morally bad that the Indigenous activists lost a concept of central importance to their resistance movement. And it's morally bad that Indigenous activists were silenced. Ditto feminism and the young people who are pushing this new understanding of gender. And while I didn't build this into the thought experiment as I described it, I'm sure we can all agree that it would add insult to injury were the Indigenous activists, who both have a prior historical claim to the concept and a morally superior claim to the concept, to be accused of disrespecting sovereign identities or hating the young people who claim to have them. Yet these ridiculous charges are made against radical and gender critical feminists all the time. Thank you.